All right, so Vijay Prashad, welcome to Reimagining Soviet Georgia.
It's a great pleasure to be with you. Come on.
So Vijay, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Right. So I'm a journalist and a writer, and I work as the chief correspondent for Globetrotter. But more than anything else, the closest thing to my heart is that I'm the chief editor of Leftward Books, and I've been with Leftward for 20 years, and we've been building up an archive ever since the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc countries collapsed. We've been building up an archive of Marxist books. We used to rely on Progress publishers to supply us with our intellectual arsenal. So we see ourselves as the inheritors of Progress publishers.
Great, and I know that you've also, written quite a bit about the Third World and the Global South. So, what are some of the things that you've written about in relation to the Global South and the Third World?
Well, after the collapse of the USSR, I thought long and hard about the impact that that collapse had on world affairs. And so I wrote a two-volume work about essentially the Third World, that was volume one, and then the Global South. So the first book was called The Darker Nations, and it told the story of the emergence of a third world project very much influenced by the experiment of international communism, because the anti-colonial movements, the liberation struggles, couldn't really have taken the shape that they did without the immense efforts of communists and people of the left in countries that ranged from South America, Chile to Indonesia. Um, and then the second book was about how this third world collapsed in the 1980s and what was going to emerge in its aftermath. And that book was The Poorer Nations, which was a possible history of the global south. So I written these two books. These are two pretty substantial histories of the world from the 1920s till the 2010s, about a 90-year history. And then subsequent to that, as the anniversary, the 100th anniversary of the October Revolution approached, I knew that there would be just appalling books coming out saying, well, October was good, but then you got Stalin, then you got the Gulag, then, these sort of evasive books, which are essentially anti communist, but claim to celebrate what happened in October 1917. So, to counter that, I wrote a very slim book, about a 110-page long book called Red Star Over the Third World, where I wanted to make return to that argument that the Soviet experiment, first, in fact, the experience of October as a revolution, and then the Soviet experiment was enormously influential for countries that were struggling with semi colonial or colonialism directly. And without the Red Star in the sky, these countries would have found it much more difficult to advance their liberation projects. So that's about where I've been as far as the themes of this particular podcast that you do is concerned.
So that actually brings us right to the first question that I really wanted to ask was, can you just talk a little bit about what the Russian Revolution in 1917 meant for the Third World and the Global South, or the non-Western world in general, both in 1917 and then maybe following that, the legacy of the Russian Revolution in particular?
You see, when Marx wrote Capital in 1867, and then the Marxist tradition develops, um, for about 40 years, the expectation was that the revolutions would take place in Europe, in Germany, for instance, perhaps in France, certainly in the United Kingdom, which had highly advanced industrial production, maybe in the United States, and so on. Because to some extent, Marx had made an assumption that where the productive forces were highly developed, you would have a clash between the forces of production, highly developed industry, and the social relations of production. In other words, private property hampering the ability of the majority of people to enjoy the benefits of those productive forces, those immensely productive industries and so on. Well, it didn't turn out like that, and that's interesting. And here the work of Lenin is so central, because Lenin, after the capitulation of the social democratic parties in Europe, the German Social Democratic Party, whom everybody assumed would lead the first left wing communist revolution, after their capitulation in 1914 to go into the Great War, the war which becomes World War One, after that, Lenin and people like Lenin began to say that, look, there is in these countries, there is a tendency to expect the development of capitalism to automatically and gradually move to socialism. This is a position well, named after, it's generally understood to be articulated by Edward Bernstein, and it's known as Bernsteinism and so on. But it was a broadly shared assumption that in a highly industrial country, you'll gradually move to socialism. Lenin argued that this is just not so, on the one hand. Secondly, he made a couple of extraordinarily important arguments for the third world. He argued, firstly, that the in a colonial context, the productive forces will never be developed. They will just never be developed. That in India, or even in a semi-colonial context of China, in Central Africa, the colonial powers are never going to develop the productive forces. So if you accept canonical, second international variants of Marxism, a very rigid form of Marxism which had developed in Europe in particular, then you condemn the colonies to never have a left revolution, a communist revolution. That was one thing Lenin argued. And he said it's the left that has to join with national liberation forces to construct first an anti colonial project, and then to deepen a left agenda by building the productive forces and socialism at the same time. That was Lenin's real advance. And that's why you develop something called Marxist Leninism, because he transforms Marxism fundamentally. The second point that Lenin makes that's very key is in his studies in Russia, in the development of capitalism in Russia from the 1890s. He argues against the Narodniks and others, the utopians, the romantics. He says, no, there is no socialism sitting in the countryside. He says that the peasantry have become like industrial workers. They are an agricultural proletariat. Therefore, we need to argue for a worker peasant alliance in order to both overcome imperialism and, in that process, construct socialism. So, these two advances of Lenin theoretically become very important, and I'm going to get to them in a second. Because what is the revolution that takes place in October 1917? It's not exactly a Russian revolution, because it's not just about the Russian people. It's a revolution against the Tsar. It's a revolution against Tsarism. The Tsarist empire was an empire in one territory. It wasn't just a country. It was imperialist, because the Russian narrow project around St. Petersburg and Moscow was oppressing a whole bunch of minority areas, like, for instance, all the way out to Uzbekistan, Chechnya on one end, and so on, Mongolia. So Lenin understood that there was an anti-colonial content. There was an anti-colonial content to the revolution that would take place against the Tsar. And so when you have this revolution taking place, the idea of national liberation is key to it. In 1915, Lenin wrote a text about the right of nations to self-determination, a set of articles which were published later. This meant that the people of South Ossetia have a national claim. The people of Tajikistan, of Armenia, and so on. That's why you don't just have one Soviet republic. It's created briefly, but then they create the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. They're separate republics. It was an anti-colonial revolution. The second thing is that revolution could not have happened without the entry of the peasants into the struggle. And these two aspects, the anti-colonial aspect of the 1917 revolution and the peasant worker alliance, these become crucial for the understanding of people in India, for people in Southern Africa, for people in Argentina, or the capacity of their countries to have a left revolution, not have to tail the bourgeoisie, but for the workers and peasants to lead the revolutionary struggle, which includes two things: one, an anti-colonial component, and secondly, a socialist component. These could happen simultaneously. So when that red star goes up in the sky, what it's saying to a peasant in China is, you can make a communist revolution. That's an enormous, enormous advance theoretically, practically, and also in terms of inspiration.
Yeah, I think Lenin being an outlier in the social democratic tradition of Europe really shows through during the Zimmerwald Conference, the sort of anti-World War I, anti-nationalist, Eurocentric viewpoint that he advocates. And so, and that was actually shocking for me to realize how very few social democrats across Europe were really anti-war, anti-nation state, anti-nationalism. And they were so comfortable within the imperial wars. With that said, the Comintern. What was the role of Comintern in like how much did it help the Third World, worldwide revolution? If it didn't help, that would be also interesting to know. And did it differ according to different epoch of different parts and leadership of the Soviet Union? Like, say, Stalin versus Khrushchev versus Gorbachev.
Well, let's recognize that after the October Revolution, the country is attacked immediately. It's attacked in terms of its finances getting cut off, and then it's militarily attacked by the Western Europeans, by the white armies, the aristocrats attempting to take power, and so on. Um, the leadership of the Soviet Republic, the first phase of their new government, hope very much for a revolutionary breakthrough to take place in Europe. And you see, of course, the Hungarian Revolution, very brief. You see the uprising in Germany when Rosa Luxemburg, Karl Liebknecht, and others led the Spartacus section of the German Social Democrats against the government. They were killed by Friedrich Ebert, who turned out, as a social democrat. And those revolutions in Europe fail. They deeply fail. And then the first revolution that takes place actually outside the USSR is in Mongolia in 1919. And you start then seeing a series of revolutions: 1945, Vietnam; 1949, China; 1959, Cuba; 1983, in Burkina Faso, and so on. You don't see any revolutions take place in Europe. You don't see any revolutions take place in North America. This is a very important point, because it meant that without help from the advanced industrial countries, the proletariat in these countries, the USSR was deeply isolated. An immensely poor country, a country that had to deal with the grip of colonialism. Again, I just want to emphasize: people think of even Russia as an advanced industrial country. It was a wretchedly backward place. In Europe in the 19th century, it was called a sick man of Europe. Both the Ottoman Empire and the Tsarist Empire and the Austro-Hungarian Empire, another wretched empire, with the grip of feudalism. I mean, a country like Hungary doesn't resemble France as much as it resembles, India under British rule. The way in which the peasantry were brutalized in Hungary, by aristocrats who just owned vast tracts of land, used immense violence to draw the surplus from the peasantry. All of this is not recognized very well. The Russian feudal landlords were horrendous. As a young person, I read Tolstoy's Resurrection. Incredible novel. It gives you a sense of even the liberal aristocrat was a wretched person. He rapes a servant and so on. Even the liberal aristocrat is a wretched person. The rights they had over human beings, it it mimicked transatlantic slavery. In fact, the gap between transatlantic slavery and post serfdom Russia, after the formal abolition of serfdom in 1861, the conditions were just horrendous. You got to understand, it was an enormously backward country, so they had to mobilize the resources in that society in a way that both advanced the productive forces and brought some elements of socialism. Typically people who are doctrinaire textbook socialists, they don't understand this, that you make a revolution in the world that we live in. You don't make a revolution from a textbook. You don't come to power and immediately do things that are perhaps possible in Scandinavia or perhaps possible in the United States if there were a revolution, because there's wealth, there's infrastructure and so on. I mean, look, the first thing they had to do in the USSR is create roads. They had to create electricity. You can't have literacy if you don't have electricity, because people are working in the day. Where are they going to learn to read in the evening? There's no lights. You have to have electrification, which is why Lenin and the Soviets put a huge amount of effort into electricity and roads, to bring people out of isolation from each other so they can see each other, travel, expand their horizons, and so on. So books could come in. Literacy campaign was enormous. This was the guiding star for the Third World movement. When Jawaharlal Nehru visits the Soviet Union in 1927, in the 10th anniversary of the revolution, he travels around the country. He writes a series of articles for the nationalist press in India. Those articles are put together in 1928. They're published in a book called Soviet Russia, little known book by Jawaharlal Nehru, in which he's got long sections where he says that, look, their peasantry looks like our peasantry, but my God, they're confident people. They're reading. They sit in the evening in a community hall and they have discussions. This level of social development in 10 years, it's incredible, he says. He says, I meet these older people from rural areas who are learning to read now, adult literacy campaigns. In other words, the USSR wasn't just about teaching the young, it was about teaching elders. It was teaching elders how to read. Adult literacy comes to the anti-colonial agenda because of the experience of the USSR. And here it was Krupskaya. Krupskaya drove this idea of having education for everybody, not just for the youth. Everybody. Why should you say that somebody is over 60 or over 50, they can't learn how to read now? No, put social resources to their education as well. It was a huge example for people around the world. At the League Against Imperialism meeting in Brussels in 1928, this idea of broad all society education, literacy campaigns, this comes on the agenda of anti-colonial movements. So when we talk about Soviet Union and anti-imperialist assistance and so on, yes, of course, people, national liberation fighters come and they train in the USSR and so on, and I'll get to the Comintern in a second. But I just want to say that it's even the example of what they were doing in their wretchedly backward society, that had been so oppressed by the Tsarist autocracy, so oppressed, people beaten without any impunity. Some aristocrat will ride on their horse into a village and just thrash people and then just ride off. There's no retribution, no justice. And that had changed. Mayakovsky, the great poet, in many occasions will say that people must talk more confidently. And when he would say that, he'd say, well, when I look out of my window, people are talking more confidently. Krupskaya herself goes into a meeting and says the women are now talking with such loud voices. Never seen working class women in a public gathering wanting their opinions heard and so on. This is not entirely true, because we get from Bobrovskaya and others. Cecilia Bobrovskaya writes that in trade union halls before the revolution, these women were extremely animated. But the point is well taken. Now they didn't want to be silenced. In the middle of all this attack on the USSR or the Soviet Republic in early years, the Communist International is seated in 1919. That's the first meeting. Again, in the first meeting, the assumption was there'll be a revolution in Germany. And it's happening, but it fails. So in 1920, when they come together again, one of the main issues on the table is anti-colonialism. And so the great debate between M. N. Roy, the Indian communist who comes as the delegate from Mexico, because, well, we're all internationalists. And Lenin, the debate over the strategy, how to deal with the national bourgeoisie in an anti-colonial struggle, that debate is overdone. People make a lot of the debate. The real point is that they were discussing anti-colonialism at an international forum, like the Communist International. It's the first time in world history there's an international forum which discusses anti-colonialism in this way. Never had this before. The Pan-African conferences come later. The conferences of anti-imperialism start in 1927-28. The Comintern in 1920 discusses anti-colonialism. We should never forget that. And that continues now. What's really interesting is from 1920 to 1943, when the Comintern is disbanded, those 23 years, communists come from all around the world and they argue like crazy, saying, the French are not taking seriously anti-colonialism. So the Vietnamese, like Ho Chi Minh, will argue that the French Communist Party is weak on its anti-colonialism. Or comrades will come from Trinidad and say, what's happening in Britain? They have fierce debates. So think about this now. A person of African descent in Trinidad is standing up and openly, defiantly talking to a white communist from Britain. This is something to think about. Where was this happening? Which forum was this happening, where somebody black, somebody white were talking as equals about a political issue? They were talking as equals. This is in the international communist movement. And so the Comintern played an enormous role in creating different forms of engagement about issues of colonialism and so on. And I mean, frankly, John Radell, Nazif Mullah, and I edited a book about the Comintern and the colonies. The book came out in 2017, 2018, called Liberate the Colonies. It's really interesting that 100 years after the Comintern, this is one of the first books that assembles the debates in the Comintern meeting around the colonial question specifically. There have been lots of books published about the Comintern and the German Revolution, Comintern and Europe and so on. But 100 years later, thanks to the leadership of John Radell, we brought out a book on the Comintern and the colonial question.
I think there's many points you spoke to, but one of the things I was kind of wanted to hone in on is this question of the influence of the Soviet Union as for the colonies or for the third world and for third world struggles, on one hand, as a vision of national liberation and the Soviet Union's particular like ethno-federal structure, the ways in which you mentioned how non-Russian peoples of the periphery were being empowered, given their own territories more or less, and the Soviet Union as an industrial model that colonies could actually, in colonial struggles and colonial revolutionary, anti-colonial revolutionaries could look to as a model by which they could undermine dependency on the imperial centers. And I'm curious about, and then on another point, the romantic revolutionary dynamics of the Russian Revolution being an influence, like you mentioned, Leninism, and even the experience of the Russian Revolution being an influence on revolutionaries trying to bring about a new society. And I'm wondering if there's a way you could maybe talk about these particular dynamics, both the Soviet Union as an industrial or economic model, the Soviet Union as a ethno-national kind of guidebook or whatever, more or less moving away from the imperial setting.
Yeah. So revolutions don't happen in a petri dish. They happen in real life. And you can't have an attitude of philosophy towards politics. You just can't have that attitude, because perfection is simply not possible in an imperfect world. You strive towards perfection. You struggle to create policies, to create government structures and so on that resemble something like the good. You strive towards that. You can't just enter into world history and tabula rasa, clean slate. You just make some fantastic situation of all people are equal and so on. It doesn't work like that. You've got to deal with patriarchy, you've got to deal with ethnic differences and hierarchies of ethnicities. You've got to deal with, in place like India, caste, in most of the world, race, and so on. You've got to deal with these things. You can't just wish them away and say, well, we've had a revolution, it's all clean now. Let's now build a perfect society. Sometimes people take a philosophical attitude towards the history of the left in the world. They judge the left based on principles that are just not possible that easily. And people who have experience of politics know that it's a muck. You have to get into compromises, you have to drive an agenda, you have to advance a process, you have to try to, it's like a boat, I suppose. Listen, I can't even barely swim, so I don't know why I'm giving you this analogy, but it's like yachting. You've got the winds blowing from all different directions. You have to get to a certain point, you try your best to keep the sails and the rudder, and you keep tacking this way. Politics is like that. It's like trying to drive a sailboat in a gale storm, especially if you're the left, because you're getting attacked by everybody. The wind is coming from all different contradictory directions. And so you've got to try to keep your hand on the rudder. You've got to make sure the sails properly calibrate the direction and speed of the wind, the velocity, and so on. That's how we have to understand politics. When these very young Bolsheviks take power in the vast, sprawling Russian Empire under attack and so on, they have to figure out the fact that many of the populations inside this empire, not a majority, but many of the populations, wanted freedom from the yoke of Tsardom. And so in that context, the Bolsheviks decided, well, look, everybody gets their own national republic in a sense, but what should that republic be based on? Because you don't want to base it on some sort of rigid identity, race of a people. After all, look at the situation in Hungary, where the Magyar idea of the Magyar was used so effectively by the Hungarian feudal lords to crush the so-called Slavs and so on. They understood the danger of rigid identities like that. So how do you base it? Well, you base it on culture, on nationality. One of the texts that was widely read in the third world was Stalin's text on linguistic nationalism. On the basis of nationality should be language and cultures which you can learn, not race, not biology. It should not be based on biology. So in that sense, when the USSR was finally founded out of the Soviet Republic, the basis of each of the republics was not biology. It was supposed to be culture and language. And this was a struggle. How do you differentiate between a republic, a Soviet republic like Uzbekistan, where they have like anyway 6 languages and so on, and there's an identity of being Uzbek, but the Uzbek identity is not, it should not be understood as racial in the biological sense. It should be understood as cultural, so that if somebody comes into Uzbekistan from India, they can become Uzbeks. They can learn the language of Uzbekistan, the languages of Uzbekistan, some of the cultures. They can form some sort of integration into the culture, even if they keep their own cultural words, because you got to have room for minorities and so on. This was an enormous project of, let's call it, use an anachronistic word from the United States, it's a multicultural project. It's multiculturalism in the 1920s. Well, what it really is, it's less multiculturalism, and it's more an idea of a multinational state project. When India wins independence in 1947, um, the Indian government that comes to power, led by Jawaharlal Nehru, and the left, the communist left inside the Lok Sabha, inside the parliament, they decide, even in the Constituent Assembly, they decide to shape India's different states, because India is very much like the USSR in terms of the fact it's a hugely diverse country. It's not just, there's no Indian. It's the same way the Russian, the figure of the Russian should not be overemphasized in the USSR. In India, they decided to divide states. The state project of organization was on linguistic grounds. So there's the state of West Bengal That's the Bengali speaking people. There's the state of Tamil Nadu. That's the Tamil speaking people. The exact example that enabled India to form in this way was from the USSR. That was the exact theoretical advance, that you can actually create bonds between people on the basis of language. And this is democratic because it's the language of the people. It's not an imposed language. It's not Hindi imposed on the Tamil speaking people. You allow the Tamil speaking people a state. But the basis of their unity is not race. The basis of their unity is linguistic nationalism, what Stalin called linguistic nationalism. So these are the kinds of experiments that they took on in the USSR, which flew out to other parts of the world. But I just want to emphasize this again. These are young people trying to build something in a country that had enormous problems, and they had to experiment with things. There were huge errors. If you look at the history of China, for instance, after 1949, each policy was a kind of experiment, and the costs of any experiment can be quite dramatic. There were terrible things that occur when your experiments go wrong, as they did in the USSR, in China, and other countries. We don't have a religious attitude toward the history of these projects. Everything isn't great, and just as I think the anti-communists get it wrong when they say everything was terrible. You have to understand it for what it was. You're trying to bring people out of immense poverty, immense illiteracy, immense ill health. You're trying to bring them to a different world, and that's a struggle. It's not easy. Plus, people carry their habits with them, habits of fate and religion, habits of domination and so on. You got to do a lot of work to transform people. Sociological change cannot necessarily be legislated. And that's something that we have to come to terms with, that just because you have a Soviet republic or a USSR doesn't mean you can just, again, like this, eradicate patriarchy. It's a huge struggle.
Towards the middle, or towards the, I should say, the middle of the 20th century, as the Cold War is happening, you start to have the Third World be a place of struggle between imperial powers, right? You have the West, Western imperialists, looking at the Third World as a theater upon which they're going to, vie for influence and for authority on newly decolonizing world, new decolonizing areas, against the Soviet Union. And within the global communist movement, you also have splits, right? You have China, you have an anti imperialist movement that takes up the imagination of the Western left. You also have the uh, non aligned movement, right? Now, the non aligned movement obviously had, I would say, more often than not socialist sympathies, but there was an attempt, at least in the imagination, that there could be a third way, right, to overcome the big power conflict of the Cold War. And I'm wondering if you could just talk a little bit about the effect of these power struggles, these splits, both ideologically and between different interests over the influence of the Cold War, how that maybe influenced the socialist imagination in the Third World, and what that struggle itself, those differences and those splits could tell us about the Soviet Union's relationship to the Third World. I know it's a big question, but
Well, but let's start with how the Second World War ends. I mean, how does the Second World War end? The Second World War ends with, on the one side, um, the dividing line in Eastern Europe that runs right through Germany, and on the other side, it ends with the atom bombs thrown on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But while these two bookends take place, what do we see? We see the Dutch return to Indonesia. We see the French return to Indochina. We see the British uneasy about leaving India. We see eventually the terrible British repression in Malaya and in Kenya and in other parts in Rhodesia, other parts of its colonial empire. That's what we see. It's a hideous world after 1945. It's not easy. We see in the western part of Europe the return of the Nazis. In West Germany, certainly there was no denazification. That's the difference between the two Germanys. In the eastern part of Germany, the Soviets ran a denazification project. In the West, they basically put the Nazis back in power. In the judiciary, in science and technology, no businesses were penalized, and so on. In much of the Western imagination, suddenly the USSR stood in for Nazism. That was the kind of intellectual work of people like Hannah Arendt, whose book The Origins of Totalitarianism is published in 1951. That's a Cold War book. It's trying to say that Nazis no longer are Nazis. The real Nazis are the communists. It's an extraordinarily dangerous argument that starts and is an instrument of the Cold War. So that's where it all begins. And the USSR, from 1945 onward, plays a very complicated role trying to advance anti-colonial struggles. You see this, uh, and why do I say complicated? Because you see, they were also worried, in the context of the Cold War, in the context of being very much outflanked by the military power of the United States. They did not want to provoke too great a crisis. This lesson was learnt in Korea, when both the Chinese and the Soviets advanced with the communists of Korea, the struggle to liberate Korea, and the United States just came in with enormous military force, enormous military force, the landing of MacArthur at Incheon Bay and so on. This really startled the leadership of the USSR. It startled also the Chinese. And when the dividing line was created, the DMZ was created, I think there was a sigh of relief all around, because the Soviets worried at that time, the Chinese worried that the US would land an atomic bomb in Moscow, in Beijing. This is before real deterrence started. They worried about the immense advantages of US power. Um, so there was hesitancy to fully, support liberation struggles around the world. But that's why I say it's complicated. But nonetheless, there was support, a lot of support. The Just give you one example: the African National Congress from 1945, well, around 1945, from the Freedom Charter years of 51 onwards till 1994, was essentially principally supported by the USSR. We just have to face that. The USSR supported the struggles of Ho Chi Minh and the Vietnamese people against the wars, first of the French and then the United States. Material came from the USSR there. So the USSR played that role. There was a great issue between the Chinese and the Soviets. Not only that, between the Albanians and the Yugoslavians, and everybody had a fractious sort of agenda. That's the nature of disagreements in international left movements. This, nothing should be surprising. The actual gap between Chinese and US internationalism is actually quite, in USSR internationalism, the gap between Chinese and Soviet internationalism is actually not that great. Both of them, in different ways, supported projects abroad. Both of them hesitated because they were afraid of the retaliation. And in fact, the principal issue between the Soviets and the Chinese was around things like their border dispute. It was around worries. Let's remember that in the nationalist period, the Soviets basically controlled Xinjiang province, and control large parts of Mongolia. It's only afterwards that Soviet influence in Xinjiang decreases. So the Chinese feared, Soviet presence, the much overwhelming power of the Soviets. Mao had some problems with, the Soviets from 1920s onward, at least in their understanding of it. So they had their own particular problem. And in a way, the Sino-Soviet dispute, as it becomes called from the 50s onward, does have a negative impact on the national liberation struggles around the world. Because in many countries, two factions of the left will develop: a Soviet faction and a Chinese faction. And this was unfortunate because they were inheriting a clash over these two countries, which had no meaning in places like, let's say, India or Angola or wherever. There was no meaning in this clash. It was an inherited clash. So that was unfortunate. And the Sino-Soviet dispute is one of the great tragedies of the international left in the 20th century, in my opinion.
Yeah, I agree with that. I would like to go back to how Soviet Union and Russian Revolution, Lenin, Stalin was seen. as how I'd like to look at it is like two different ways. One is, Stalin can be inspirational for, actually, and he is for a lot of the world. People carry his picture as like he is, a symbol of hope for them and the ability to struggle for the little man to sort of make it, despite the fact that he's hated as a mass murderer in other parts of the world. So there's like the aspirational, inspirational, hope giving parts of the people who you never expected to pull off a revolution. And then there's the second part, which is actual material support given for third world or around the world to wage these liberation revolutionary struggles.
So the first thing is the Stalin question. You know, well, it's an interesting thing. Why is it that you walk into a Chinese communist office in 1975, 78, whatever, and you'd see a picture of Stalin? Especially given the fact that historically, the Chinese communists and Stalin had a great dispute. That resulted in loss of life in the crackdown in Shanghai in 1927. Um, and the disagreements they had about the relationship with the nationalists, and yet there were these pictures. In India, you go into the communist office and there'll be a picture of Stalin. What is the meaning of that picture? Is that picture referencing what? Is it referencing the Gulag? Is that the reference? No, actually, it's interesting. um, After the death of Stalin, when Khrushchev gives his famous speech denouncing Stalin, Khrushchev gives that so-called secret speech, although it's leaked immediately. He gives that speech in order to drive a what is considered to be a revisionist, policy within the USSR and also internationally to some extent, because Khrushchev and that group of people will put a lot of support in bourgeois third world governments. Khrushchev will travel to India, for instance, and embrace Jawaharlal Nehru in this period, at the same time as Nehru is cracking down on the communists inside India. So, what the communists do is they just take up Stalin as this symbol against revisionism. So, you put the picture of Stalin up to critique Khrushchev. It's not necessarily about Stalin himself, but it's about taking a more orthodox position against revisionism, holding the line for a Bolshevik kind of history rather than a conciliation with the West and so on, kind of conciliation, collaboration with imperialism. That's the image of Stalin. It's a considerable history actually to pay attention to. This is different from the debate about who is Stalin, what was Stalin's role in the USSR, and so on. We don't have time to get into that. But this is the principal reason why the figure of Stalin emerges. And the idea of the Soviet Union in this period, despite whatever the ebbs and flows of Soviet radicalism in its own history, the idea of the Soviet Union is very considerable. It's not just the Soviets; it's also the German Democratic Republic, the DDR, provided immense support to African national liberation. Outside Berlin, there was a camp to train fighters. People went to study there about national liberation. But I don't want to emphasize the support of the USSR and Eastern Europe merely for building revolutionary movements around the world. I also want to say that millions of students came to the USSR to study medicine. Millions of students came to study, veterinary sciences, came to study about, astronomy, came to study about all kinds of things. It was the Soviet Union that launched the first Cuban into space. The first Latin American went from the Soviet Union. The first Indian to go to space went on a Soviet rocket. The first African to space went on a Soviet rocket. I mean, these histories are very, very important. It's not just the support for liberation struggles and so on. It's also the sociological changes that they engendered. Bringing in millions of people to study high science, high art, computer science, and so on, had an enormous impact in countries around the world. And why do I say this? Because the West also brought students, because these students all came and studied without having to pay, without having to go into debt, so they could return to their societies and contribute fully. This is an immense debt that the world owes to the USSR. Millions of doctors trained, millions of them trained in public health. Where are the public health doctors today?
So, we're 30 years after the Soviet Union's collapse now. So, what can you say was the effect for the third world, for the future of the left, or maybe let me rephrase that. What can you say was the effect of the Soviet Union's collapse on the trajectory of anti-colonial projects, uh, anti-colonial struggles, and a global anti-imperial movement, for lack of a
Well,
better word?
ask the Iraqi people; they'll give you the answer fully. I don't need to tell you anything. There was many impacts, but it's not just the fall of the USSR and the Eastern European communist state project. It was also the collapse of the third world. I mean, the debt crisis, which predates the fall of the USSR by a decade, from 79 to 84, 85. That debt crisis had an enormous impact on the third world. And the combination of the collapse of the third world project and then the collapse of the USSR, the Eastern Europe communist state project, this had an enormous impact. I mean, it removed the shield against US aggression, for instance, because right after that, the United States behaves in Panama like an old gunboat imperialist, bombs, takes out Manuel Noriega. That's in 1989. As the Soviet Union is flailing under the very poor leadership of Mikhail Gorbachev. And then, 91, when Saddam gets bombed, he's sitting inside his palace with Hamdani, his culture minister, and they're discussing where's the USSR. That's exactly what they're talking about in the transcripts that are later released. They record their conversation. Where's the USSR? Well, it's gone. And look at Iraq now, millions killed by an illegal war. That illegal war may not have happened in that way, in that form, if the USSR had been around. We are now slowly coming back to multipolarity, and I'm looking forward to that, because without a multipolar world, you can't advance struggles in every society. You have one power imposing itself on the world. That's very unhealthy.
For my last question, I would like to ask, what would you say to those people that claim the Soviet Union was an imperial project? It was colonization. They even have in Georgia, they have a Soviet occupation museum that tries to make the case that this was an occupation, that this was imperialism. So what would you say to them?
Well, I mean, look, they have their own experiences and their own understanding of things and so on. But I would say it's a rather narrow-minded approach, because um, it doesn't it doesn't acknowledge where these countries were in, say, 1910s. Where were you in the 1910s? Who was going to advance the anti-feudal project in your countries? I would like to ask the Hungarians. Uh, at what cost did a modern society get created in your country? You had Nazism before the Nazis. Who fought the Nazis? Who created the possibility of a modern Hungary? Who fought off the landlords? Who died fighting the landlords? And then, when the autocrats attempted to come back to power, who defended you? I mean, people need to face those questions. So, I mean, look, if you want to create a museum that says the Soviet Union is imperial, you're entitled to do that. You have a very narrow perspective. On the other hand, it's an ungenerous perspective to the lives that were sacrificed in order to create a modern world for you. So, go ahead, make your museums or whatever, because those are funded by your oligarchs, often funded by the classes that were wretched to, or that kicked you in the face in 1916. If you want to believe the people who put their boot on the head of your ancestor in 1916 rather than the person who was trying to push them off, it's up, that's your choice. But then let's be explicit. Let's say that you want to have fealty to the Nazi project, which is what you see now with the kind of people agitated into politics by Viktor Orban in Hungary. You see this in Poland. You see this in so many countries. These hideous political projects have returned. It's not accidental. And they didn't return because of Trump. They returned because you decided to besmirch the history of the left. and you decided to say the history of the left was autocratic. Well, welcome to your present. It's not my present, it's your present.
Ian, thank you so much for coming on to Reimagining Soviet Georgia. Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself? What do you teach?
So basically, I teach world literature. I've been teaching world literature on and off for about 10 years now. I teach at Georgetown University in Qatar, here in the Middle East. And I think like one of the things you thinking of like some of the themes that you've been talking about in your podcasts. One of the things that's emerging now in world literature is like how we not only how we think of the planet, yeah, and the possibility that the way we are thinking about the literature of the planet and the history of the planet in ways which seem to be increasingly Euro-American. So for about 150 years now, the term world literature has been around. And of course, Marx was one of the people to develop the term. It begins with Goethe, Weltliteratur, in the 1820s, 1830s. And I would say over the past sort of 50 years, there's been a number of, well, to begin with, there's been a huge sort of explosion of popularity in the term. So a lot of people have been thinking about what world literature means. What does it mean to have a world literature? What does it mean to think of the world in terms of the literature it produces? This is partly due to the US. The US, as you perhaps know, has world literature as a course on almost every single university syllabus. So it's an enormously popular course. So in many ways, it's something which formulates very early on in an undergraduate's mind an idea of what the rest of the planet is. Um, but even though this term and this concept has been around for about 150 years, over the past 50 years, there's been increasing degree of unease about the way it's developed. And of course, today, some of that unease we're going to talk about is in terms of um, the way communism and the way the former Soviet bloc countries are almost completely either airbrushed out of the history of cosmopolitanism, or the way they are sort of very sort of monodimensionally presented in this kind of Manichaean good versus evil, freedom versus totalitarian struggle. Okay, um, but to be fair, it really started from a post-colonial angle. So there was a feeling that to a large extent some of the writers that have become famous globally have become famous primarily because of a European and American lens. So the Salman Rushdies, the Najib Mahfouzes, there are token writers that we sort of choose, um, but it seems to be a very sort of Western optic that for example, very often in the case of India, they're very often English language writers. Even though 90% of the subcontinent doesn't have English as a native language, there is this kind of bias towards English language writers over local language writers. So it's against that background of like people asking what is world literature and why is world literature determined by sort of Western metropolitan centers like Berlin, New York, London, Paris. Um, I think in this respect, people are beginning to sort of, in a serious way, interrogate this. And I think one of the things that has emerged is that um, And what I found really disturbing, and what I picked up from your first podcast, really is the way any memory of, without getting into the whole debate about whether the Soviet Union was great or not, like weary debate, but any memory of the kind of Soviet internationalism in the literary scene, and particularly the strong alliance that the Soviet anti-capitalism made with anti-colonialism, this is really sort of being sort of completely left out of the picture. And Amir Mufti, in a recent book called Forget English, spends part of a chapter on this point. So, for example, we forget that so many African American writers in the U.S. Were regularly invited by the Union of Soviet Writers. So very famous names like Langston Hughes and Richard Wright and Audre Lorde. These were writers who came to the Soviet Union and sort of came to international congresses in various Eastern European countries. And really, you got a sense of a genuine internationalism trying to be created. And I think there's something really exciting about the way, in their best moment, I'm going to be sort of completely honest, okay? Like, it was clear that there was definitely a propagandistic element to some parts of it, that, the Soviet Union did, certain elements in the Soviet Union, in the Soviet elite, did use this with propagandistic aims in mind. But that certainly doesn't sort of discount this tremendous sort of thirst for bringing Indian and African American writers and Southeast Asian writers together, and getting them to talk across each other's boundaries instead of adopting sort of the West as some kind of mediator that decides what is great literature and what isn't. So, I mean, here's like a personal anecdote, right? In 2001, I was backpacking in Romania. I just went sort of for a week. I just went sort of backpacking around Romania. And I was in a place called Sibiu, which is a beautiful town in the middle of Romania. Really rainy, cold, wintry day, looking for a youth hostel. And I walked across the street corner and I looked up, and on the top of the street corner, there was a plaque which said in Romanian and then in English, this house was visited by the great Indian poet Rabindranath Tagore in 1936. And it was just like, it was it was completely by chance, but it's an example of how these Soviet institutions, like the Writers' Union, really sort of had a kind of internationalist vision, a kind of South-South-South alliance that would get writers from Cairo and Bangkok and Buenos Aires and Santiago to sort of come together and try and imagine a different kind of literature. And it's interesting to see, and I just wanted to stress that I'm not an expert. There's people like Michael Denning have written on this in quite some detail, but it is interesting to see how the cliches of like socialist realism, which is what people always were very quickly being abandoned by the Soviet Union themselves. And in fact, interestingly, when Gabriel Garcia Marquez's 100 Years of Solitude came out, in the Soviet Union, this was very exciting. It was translated into Russian. And, a lot of people, because there was always, before that, there did tend to be a kind of battle of, if someone was modernist, they were sort of capitalists, and if they were realist, they were good Soviet socialist writers, right? And I think this is in part due to critics like Georg Lukács, the Hungarian critic, who famously wrote very negatively about Kafka. I think sort of what was interesting, perhaps in the last decades of the Soviet Union, was this really sustained attempt to imagine what a what a modern, innovative Soviet socialist literature might look like. Not simply sort of like endless narratives about factory workers getting together to overthrow, but sort of genuine sort of experimentation, right? There's Russian people who say that too. That's that just. But yeah, I mean, I think, and I think, and this moves into what for me is a much more general point. Like today, everyone and their second cousin is anti-racist, right? It's cool to be racist, like it's cool to be anti-racist, like Walmart, IBM, everyone's tripping over themselves to that. But people forget that in the 50s in the US, the only people who spoke out against racism were communists. The only white people who spoke. Yeah, people have airbrushed this out of this history, right? But the only serious voices in the 50s, before it was cool, the only serious voices who is sometimes, as we famously know, even lost their lives for protesting against sort of racism, was the communists and socialists in the US. And I think you see that reflected in the way African Americans, not all, but definitely there was a coterie of African Americans, including famously the singer Paul Robeson, right, who visited the Soviet Union and was sort of. I think Richard Wright talks about this. He says how refreshing it was just to sort of be acknowledged as a human being. They felt that they were, when they came to Moscow and when they came to Leipzig or Dresden, they just felt it just felt acknowledged as human beings. Um,
I
so
believe
yeah,
I
that's
think I believe Langston Hughes famously said after not being segregated on a train during his visit to the Soviet Union that there's no Jim Crow in the Soviet Union
right, right,
because of the fact that he was not segregated when he was taking a train across the country during his trip there. Um,
right. And also, like, I mean, again, this is complete chance, right? I didn't do this because of your podcast at all. But last week I was teaching a text by Audre Lorde called Zami. It's her autobiography. And there's a little paragraph at the bottom of the second or third page where she says, I want to give thanks to I think the University of Moscow for spending 2 weeks there at the Soviet International Writers Congress. And it's a little paragraph in small print in 1976, I think. Um, but I think what I'm interested in is the success with which this is being airbrushed out. I think that for me is what is most disturbing. Like it's nice to remember this, but what I found a bit appalling, really, is the kind of stunning success with which a variety of mainstream institutions, I'll include things like Netflix, have like gone with this sort of very this sort of convenient amnesia. There's something really because I know certainly know talking with my own students who are like 20 years old, right? It's just completely it's cast iron now. The way it's not like the communism was evil, it was totalitarian. Um, there's no, I mean, I'm gasping. I'm for nuance, even for a second moment of doubt. But it's very difficult to start. You have to say to the students, it's not obviously there was this tremendous effort to sort of portray communism as evil and murderous and tyrannical. And what I say, at least to my students, is like it's not that the truth was the opposite. The truth was kind of muddied in the middle. Like, of course there was sort of more, there was imprisonment and there was in some cases the secret police, and there were sort of restrictions. But there was also tremendously good things about it. There was a tremendous investment in technology. There was free education. There was significantly less pornography, significantly less crime, and certainly many of us on the left in Germany um, are witnessing the disturbing way in which now the history of Germany, of East Germany, they're really it's basically the revenge of the German right, who have had to suffer Nazi hunting for 30 years, right? Now they're getting their revenge, either by smoking out all the Stasi ex-spies, or by presenting this frankly ludicrous idea that the Stasi and the former East was DDR was like the Nazi Germany, which is just factually wrong on so many levels. So yeah, I guess that's where I empathize with your podcast. This institutional uh, and on so many levels, a kind of institutional reworking of history. Um,
And it's happening everywhere. Just listening to you, listening to many other people, it's really happening everywhere. And that's what's kind of worrying, that it's not just a post-communist world that's doing this. It's everywhere. Actually, in a strange way, US seems to be much more open, and at least more experimental things is coming out of there and their sort of revisionist history than it is other places. So like, I don't know, it's an interesting time, but I do think there needs to be a bit of a push, because it is. I think I like the way you put that. Like, it's like revenge of the the right wingers for 30 years being like, oh,
Mhm.
fascism is bad. It's like, and even
right,
like my friend, she was in Berlin. She just told me this. She was like talking about our podcast, and she said they took like a tour of like either the Holocaust Museum or something, and she was saying how one of the camps, she was saying the woman that was the tour guide was saying how it was, oh, concentration camp and so on. She's like, and then the Soviets came, and she's like, the same thing continued with the Soviets. They made it into a prison. And it's like, keeping a certain like infrastructural, integrity of a concentration camp and housing prisoners is very different than a concentration camp. Like,
Mhm.
just because they happen in the same location, it's not the same. But she was definitely equating that. The tour guide, and she was like, I remember thinking this was like really strange. She said that, but then again, you just think sometimes these things are fluke. Oh well, maybe she just didn't mean that. Or, but then you're seeing it's not just a fluke; it's what they're told. Clearly, they're not
right,
probably going off on their own. They're This is what they're being told to say. Just like the Stalin Museum in Gori now has like a room. Before it was like Stalin's life in childhood and whatever, and now it has a room of how he's a murderer. Like they don't
right,
alone anymore. It's like you have to know the real truth. And it's funny because that's what the entire town makes money off of the Stalin Museum
Mhm.
visitations. They live off, the whole town lives off
Mhm.
on that money. It's crazy. And that's why most people are going to that town for Stalin's birthplace.
right.
Otherwise,
Okay.
nobody would ever go there.
Mhm.
But but I
But
want
can I just say, like, I find one of the negative consequences of this as well for us is that then there's no place on the left to be able to critique some of these things, like I would genuinely want to critique the Stasi, okay? Obviously we would genuinely want to critique, but that space is robbed, you
Yeah.
know?
Mhm.
That for me is one of the things, like you can't even be balanced because already it's already so skewed that to be balanced is to opt into this whole
That
facade.
Yeah, and I think that there's unfortunately, at least in the United States and in maybe Western Europe as well, that the anti-communism runs so deep, and the Cold War anti-communism runs so deep that those on the left who maybe have well-intentioned critiques of the Soviet Union end up doing so from a place very uninformed about the realities of it, the what the Soviet Union actually was. Some basic historical facts get misconstrued because I think that the cultural and political war in the United States against Soviet communism was so extreme that a lot of people were raised on it like it was their mother's milk, you know?
Right, right.
Um, so a lot of times, like looking back in my childhood in the U.S., are required readings. Well, of course, they're mostly all Western or certain selections made by what they consider world literature, but mainly there are a lot of dystopian novels you're forced to read in like middle school to warn you about the big state, aka communism.
Mhm.
Reading Orwell or the other books that they always make us read, and the other Orwell, I forget the names of them. But
Aldous Huxley?
Alex, yes, yeah, yeah, Aldous Huxley, yeah, Aldous Huxley, and I remember I think even reading, like, looking back, I didn't know the author, but then I looked at it, I think we even read Ayn Rand. So a lot of times I'm realizing that people's perception of communism, even here, is based on dystopian novels they've read
Mm,
about it.
Mm-hmm.
So
mm,
literature has played a huge role in contributing our understanding of the Soviet Union. So I don't know if, and also second point, which is what was brought up, and a lot of almost all the dissidents became huge, right, in the West. All the Soviet dissidents were given, or Eastern European dissidents, given all this support and promotion by the West, which they would have never gotten if they wrote about anything else, right?
mhm,
Which skewed anything coming out of and what was accepted from the Soviet Union or Eastern Europe as very anti-Soviet, against then to whatever totalitarians or or gulags or whatever it was that Big Brother's always watching any kinds of those thematically around that or their struggles. And do you think, like, I mean, do you notice that as well? I don't know, in your field, or
mhm.
what would you say about that?
Well, yeah. I mean, I think first of all, the state. To be fair to the writers themselves, uh, the status of dissident is something many writers don't want. They really, because as soon as you're a dissident, you are drained of any complexity. Yeah, your work acquires a single repeated meaning. And I certainly know, I remember reading that Solzhenitsyn had a nervous breakdown towards the end of his life. Like there was a biography that came out a few years ago of Solzhenitsyn, and he was deeply unhappy with his subsequent, his life as he was deeply frustrated towards the end of his life because, there's this, I think he felt almost tortured by the way he was used. Um, and I do think, like, I know as well, this is a very different example, but people like Orhan Pamuk, because we see versions of this even like with Muslim countries and that, we sort of, or Taslima Nasreen, the Bangladeshi writer who had to leave Bangladesh for writing a book about called Shame about women's rights. But I don't think, even though writers materially profit from dissident status, I think they come to regret it because it does turn them into caricatures. And I've certainly seen in writing like Ha Jin, if you've ever read the Chinese writer Ha Jin, who he's I've told a few of his stories, and to be fair to him, because he came in exile from communist China, he's in his 50s now, and he lives in the US. Um, I never read his stories because I assumed it would all be about the brave liberal soul struggling in an oppressive. Um, but to give credit where credit's due, I've read a couple of his stories. They're actually very clever. They're um, they don't go with that standard narrative at all. They're actually they're as critical of the kind of liberal narrative within China as they are of the standard Communist Party narrative. Do you know what I mean? And I think that was what, as I mentioned um, with the magazine Foreign Literature, which was a Soviet magazine in the 70s and 80s. I think that was one of the frustrations in Russian literature, like trying to find a way to produce literature in the service of a socialist or a communist ideal without rendering it banal. Um, and I think that I mean, okay, I'm going to turn to cinema now instead of literature, but I think Tarkovsky is a wonderful example of that. I think Tarkovsky, who seemed to get fired on by all sides, right? And the poor guy, I kind of feel sorry for him. He seemed to get sort of when you're kind of screwed when you grow up in a communist country. You know, you're damned if you do, you're damned if you don't, right? I do have some sympathy for him, but I do feel that sort of writers like Zamyatin and directors like Tarkovsky really sort of molded something new and bold and visionary in their reflections, and showed that you can craft political art without necessarily rendering it simply as a vehicle to deliver a message, right? Um, but I forgot your question. Your question was
Just the fact that what literature we know in the last 100
right.
years coming from Eastern Europe or Soviet Union has been always under this certain umbrella of anti-Soviet literature that's been propelled forward, that skews it. And then the other question was how dystopian novels have played a huge role in us hating the Soviet Union, like sort of a triumph of literature where that's actually stronger. It trumps reality.
Mm. I mean, I always have some sympathy for Orwell because I do feel that his work was really sort of taken away from him almost. Like Animal Farm, like very few people are even aware that he was a socialist.
Socialists, right?
Yeah,
But that's not
right.
this though.
Sorry?
I've read his other stuff and it's excellent. You know,
Yeah.
Down and Out in Paris and London, excellent book. Homage to Catalonia, excellent book. I loved a lot of his
Yeah.
stuff.
That was
Yeah.
like homage to Catalonia was one of the things that got me interested in revolutionary politics when I was very young.
Right.
Suggested to me, in an
But
anarchist bookstore in the Bay
but
Area.
he has helped shape
Yeah.
almost all
Yeah.
anti-communist thought in young minds and hearts for life. You
Mhm.
know, like his sort of legacy is way beyond him or his intention.
I mean, isn't that more like with 1984? Don't you feel it's one of those situations where they see a totalitarian state and they don't want to see fascism; they want to see communism. Yeah, the 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 institutions that push this relentlessly. Like it seems to me that there's a constant single reading of texts like 1984 and like Animal Farm. Yeah, I studied Animal Farm at school when I was like 14. I remember it very well, and not many people know that the the first animated film in the UK, which was Animal Farm, we found out 10 years ago was financed by the CIA in Britain. The first British animated film ever in 1948, in 1950, had been financed. We found out like 10 years ago from the records because there's this hilarious set of messages between the CIA and MI5 because the CIA saw the film and they were really unhappy with it. They felt it wasn't. They felt it wasn't. They didn't like the ending. And the poor guy who at MI5, he says, "Well, they said that with the ending, can't you make it that the farmer that the farmer's portrayed in too negative a light? Can't you make it sort of more positive about the farmer?" And the MI5 guy is saying, "Well, that's how the book is. We can't really change it." But anyway, whatever.
It's really
But yeah, I mean, you're right that it's peddled in a certain way, but I certainly think that with 1984, it doesn't seem to me to be exclusively communist, right? There's all kinds of things in it which do seem to sort of say a great deal about British imperialism, British, because, and we haven't talked about this, but another of the things which is implicit in this discussion that we're having is not just how communism has been foregrounded, um, and fascism is acceptable to talk about because Britain and America and France were always perceived as its opponents. Yeah, even if Churchill's real dispute with Hitler was not ideological, it was territorial. Um, but I think it's interesting to see how deeply sensitive people in the West are to calling European imperialism, to put in European and American imperialism on a moral level with National Socialism.
Mhm.
There's a profound reluctance to do that, because it once you do that, it completely dissolves the whole liberal framework of discussion, right? Which is based on this kind of ridiculously Manichaean good versus evil, light versus darkness binary. But when you that for me is another stunning example of the success with which in the US um, they they've almost completely managed to extirpate any memory of the really fascist, ugly violence that was inflicted on Latin American countries between, let's say, sort of 1940 to 1990. I mean, it still continues, but the peaks were in the 70s and 80s, and like, and you've seen it in. So I saw a Tom Cruise film about um, the guy, the pilot who flew. Do you know Our Man? Do you know what I'm talking about? It was kind of big 3 or 4 years ago.
You mean the one you're talking about, the movie about the pilot who saved the airplane and landed in the
Yes,
Hudson River?
yeah, and he got shot in the end. He
Yeah.
got shot, and I can't remember which country it was, but I was shocked at the way someone who, I think it was El Salvador, but I was shocked at the way the US complicity in that situation was completely removed. You know, the criminal right wing gangs that he was working for, in Colombia, and who were wholly financed by the US because they were anti-FARC, anti-communist. Uh, that whole story was completely removed. And in most American films about Latin America, you see this. You see, it's almost like they are surgically removing all of these truly hideous histories.
They're
Um,
surgically putting that in Soviet Union,
Sorry?
and they're surgically putting all of those atrocities into the Soviet Union. So instead
Right.
of putting imperialism and colonization and U.S. supported coups on trial, they put communism on trial again, and without a defense attorney.
Mhm.
Right. Right.
I'm actually your point about the Animal Farm cartoon being funded by the CIA brings up a question or something that as somebody who studies literature, I'd be interested to hear what you have to say about there's a lot of information that's been coming out about the way that groups like the Ford Foundation and the CIA were funding literature during the Cold War in the United States, funding poet residencies, funding writing workshops, basically trying to build up a liberal anti-communist cultural output in the United States in the second half of the 20th century. And what's interesting to me is how some of these interventions by the United States government into literary and artistic production affected the trajectory of writing, of creative output in the United States and maybe the Western cultural scene, and in what ways a kind of anti-communist orientation was taken on by people who may not have actually even been aware that that was what they were doing, participating in, and producing. And this to me has been one of the harder things to navigate. And then the second thing I'm curious about is, how do you think it's appropriate to assess a piece of literature or a film by the intention of the person who has written it or produced it versus how it was politically used? Because you mentioned Solzhenitsyn, and we talked about George Orwell. To me, it's I can say personally, for me, it's very difficult navigating these two things. On one hand, I might love a piece of literature, I might love a film, but the way that it was politically weaponized or instrumentalized is sort of something I wholeheartedly don't believe in. And I don't know if there's a good framework for how to navigate that tension. So I wonder if you could comment on any of those.
Yeah, sure. I mean, like, to put on my crude materialist hat for a moment, like,
Please
I
do,
do
please
think
do,
sort of
please do.
context. Sorry?
I said, please do, put it on.
Like, I don't, I think sort of context is everything. I do think that, I agree with you that in the end, these texts are often weaponized, and you can, in the case of Orwell, for example, you really can sort of twist and turn. I mean, I'm religious, so there's a long history of, it's extraordinary the extent to which, even if you don't agree with these texts, the idea that you have a religious text where doesn't Jesus never says a word against, literally never says a word against gay men, but he's extremely prejudiced towards one group of men, rich men. You only get negativity about rich men in the Gospels, and you would never get that listening to any sort of standard sermon on any American church on a Sunday morning, right? So there's something really sort of willful about where this kind of textual bias comes from. And I mean, obviously in some cases, it is personal. People will read into text the things they deeply feel. But I think it's more worrying when, yeah, it is harnessed in certain ways. um, and that's where we get materialist, yeah, when we find TV production companies or cinema studios deliberately, for example, with this isn't conspiracy theory, right? With Zero Dark 30 and Argo, you literally have the CIA brought into the creative process here. Yeah, you literally have people from the CIA in the studio. I find that to be way more disconcerting, yeah, than these texts. Like, for example, Hannah Arendt, she became a kind of figure of the Cold War period, right? She became a kind of Cold War warrior, and many people were disappointed with her. Um, I feel that it's a shame, because when you read the early Arendt, you realize that she's talking about, obviously, as a German Jew, she's talking about fascism first and foremost, right? She's talking about what it meant in 30s Germany for, when she's, whether it's the origins of totalitarianism, the banality of evil, the primary experience she's dealing with is, the Weimar Republic. So I do feel that there was a kind of a massive institutional attempt to take someone who was very respected, and ride that ideologically, in post-war, in an anti-communist direction. Um,
But it's
but
interesting how Arendt, Orwell, sort of leftist type, maybe Arendt, I'm not sure if she qualifies, but kind of. And she's deeply concerned about these kinds of issues, like Marx and so on. So you kind of have these sort of leftists being used mainly as the greatest sort of weapons of mass destruction towards their own ideologies they're coming from, which is that's why I think there's a certain responsibility, right? That's another maybe topic, but there's a certain responsibility within um, the artist or the writer, what they're producing in a way, because it can't just be distilled from context.
I mean, there's a
That we
responsibility,
should
a
all
bit
be
like,
factory workers all the time, not advocating them.
I mean, like, it's just though that the problem is that, if I often thought, like, if I had grown up in the GDR, okay, instead of growing up in the UK, I'm sure there are things that would have pissed me off, right? I'm sure there are things that would have. And when you talk to people, when I lived in Berlin after the wall, I was in Germany when the wall fell, and I lived in Germany for like 3 years in the aftermath, and I knew a lot of Aussies. And, they all said the same thing. They said they hated the Stasi, they hated the wall, and they hated the fact that if they went on holiday, they could only go to like Bulgaria or whatever. They couldn't go anywhere they really wanted to. But then they said loads of other things as well. They said it wasn't as bad as people said. People talked to one another. People read more. There was better TV. But there were definitely things that were wrong. And for me, the problem is that when, regardless of whether you're an RN or an Orwell or whatever, there should be the right to, within a socialist country, to criticize some things, or in the aftermath of a socialist country, to criticize that without immediately being co-opted by a set of sort of greedy capitalist, totalitarian, anti-communist agendas, right? And that's what, for me, is the saddest thing here, that space in which you could be able to legitimately say that, there were some things about the Soviet Union which were great, and there were some things which, were mistakes, is gone. It's for anyone like you and me, anyone who, you don't want to talk about it, because so many, it's so institutionally embedded already that you're just adding your voice to a propaganda machine. But then, of course, then people turn around and say you're dogmatic. But when I said materialist, I really mean that we have to sort of look at the material ways in which these narratives are being amplified. And I mean, one of the questions for me is like, how centralized is that? Is there a center to that? Is there really a direction? When we get, whether it's Netflix, whether it's, HarperCollins or the New York Times, is there a kind of actual agenda, like like in the 60s and 50s, Hoover and the Ford Institute and all of these like think tanks? I know there's think tanks like the Heritage Trust, but I don't know if they are as powerful as people think they are. I think they definitely have a lot of money, but I am more worried about the spontaneous reproduction of these narratives. Yeah, I think there's a lot of spontaneous repetitions of these narratives, which of course is the desired effect, right? But which are worse because they're not being paid by anyone. To give an example, Mohammed Hanafi has wrote about 5 years ago one of Pakistan's bestsellers called "The Case of Exploding Mangoes," and it's set in the years of Zia ul Haq, right, in the 70s, 80s. And as you probably know, Zia ul Haq, the Pakistani dictator, was financed in part by the CIA. And when I read the book, it's a funny book, but what really disturbed me, this is a resident Pakistani author, okay? Not even US, like resident Pakistani author. In the acknowledgements of the book, he puts as one of his sources a Hollywood film with Tom Hanks and Julia Roberts about Zia ul Haq, Charlie's War. Like, this is completely seriously, not even to criticize, completely seriously. This is like and there's not many sources, and he puts that as one. So think about that. Like, this is an American film about Zia ul Haq, and a Pakistani writer has incorporated this into one of Pakistan's best-selling novels.